Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim, here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I'm not going to go on and on here because we have part 2 of our conversation with Wesley Anderson, taken from our live YouTube show that we did a few days ago. And I just want to make sure that everybody gets to it. Tim, how are you?
I'm doing great, and yes, so we're going to jump right into this conversation with Wesley Anderson, author of the book Lou and JonBenét. His friend Lou Smit passed away, but he worked for the DA's office in Boulder and came up with a theory of an intruder. And so that's what we are discussing here today with Wesley Anderson. And also check out the Netflix docuseries Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, if you haven't seen it already. John Anderson had a part in that. And also, if you haven't heard part 1, stop this right now and listen to part 1, because this is going to be a continuation of that conversation.
And if you haven't read Wesley Anderson's book, Lou and JonBenét, you can pick that up at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, anywhere you get your books. Just simply search for that. And be sure to stay tuned for our final thoughts. At the end of this episode, we're going to be compiling our thoughts from part 1 and part 2.
All right, everyone. Please follow us on social media at Missing CSM. Thanks a lot for listening. We're going to take a quick break for commercial, and we'll be right back with Wesley Anderson.
I want to address Susie's comment here. Could the intruder, assuming that, like, if this is, we're going down the intruder theory path, could the intruder have been someone that the Ramseys know, someone that was invited to the Christmas party at their house and hid out the entire time?
Well, the Christmas party on Christmas night was at a neighbor's house, not at their house. There have been other people, in the home many times. So Lou believed that the suspect probably had been in the home prior to this. Don't know if that means that, he came in, with, another group, to look at the house when it was set up for the previous year, for kind of a parade of homes, that the Ramseys had allowed their home to be used for a couple of Christmas seasons, bringing in people for donations, to look at homes in the Boulder area. Or if it was part of a work crew, they had a major remodel. But Lou thought it was such a large home that this person probably had either been in the home before, and had a sense of where things were laid out and where the bedrooms were positioned. He didn't think that the person had just come in, went right to her bedroom. He thought that he had been in the home most likely several times before.
Yeah, I think that's a fair belief there. I know that John Douglas did some work on this case as well, and John Douglas was one of the first criminal profilers from the FBI's behavioral science unit. And he even wrote a book, and it wasn't completely about the JonBenét Ramsey case, but he did spend a large section of that book talking about the case. And he's on the same page as you and Lou. And so if there is more skepticism out there, I do just want to mention that, because whether or not some listeners had heard of Lou Smit before this, he is genuinely regarded as a wonderful detective. And I think the public perception of John Douglas is that he was a wonderful investigator as well, and criminal profiler. One thing he mentioned was that when killers will stage a scene, typically they set it up for someone else to find the murdered victim, and that obviously wasn't the case here with John, because John himself found JonBenét. But my question to you is there a profile of the killer that you believe holds water?
I think the profile is someone who was a previous violent sexual offender. And Lou didn't believe that, and I don't believe this either, that this was just done spur of the moment. As with most sex offenders, they start younger, and then they escalate, in violence, and This was very elaborate. There were a lot of things that needed to happen, things being brought into the crime scene, things taken from the crime scene. Lou believed that this kind of a pedophile had almost certainly preyed on young girls previously, and probably afterwards too. And tragically, sex offenders is one of those criminal offenders who can't really be rehabilitated. Sometimes you outgrow, certain types of crimes, property crimes or whatever. But sex offenses is once that person's reached that level of violence, that's something that stays with them, that they don't ever, outgrow. So Lou believed that this killer was either apprehended on another case and incarcerated where he couldn't reoffend after a period of time, don't know when, or he was dead. And that's still something we wrestle with now, 28 years later. If we do get a match on the ID identification through the forensic evidence, the DNA, will this case be prosecutable? Which we hope. This person needs to be held accountable. One of the things that John Ramsey does bring out in the docuseries and on the 2020 special, and whenever he speaks, he talks about this, is how cold cases all over the country have been solved using DNA genetic profiles of private databases, 23andMe and other public databases. And that's something that, as far as we know, the Boulder Police have refused to do. Don't know why. That's something that John Ramsey and our team, our Smit family team, have several times tried to encourage. We even said we'll use our GoFundMe account. If there's a cost, we'll pay for the lab expenses because they're not free. And we do have some funds left in our account. We spent down probably $45,000-$50,000 out of what we've collected so far, but we still have money that we'd commit, to using private labs to test, the DNA, to retest, the DNA on the clothing or what was taken from the autopsy, because you use, more modern technologies. You can sample smaller sample sizes. We're down to nanograms and picograms when it comes to DNA analysis. So we've offered, to use what financial, or we'll try to raise more money if that's the hindrance. We had heard at one point that that all of this DNA testing costs a lot of money, and they may not have the budget to support that. I don't know if that's true. Boulder's a fairly wealthy community, and I would think a high profile case like this, they would fund whatever the city would fund the police department to pay for that testing. But if that's not possible, well, we certainly will help any way that we can.
I want to go back real quick to what you said about the killer either dead or incarcerated, and I have a couple of points or a question on that. Has your investigation and the investigative team looked into similar crimes that were committed in the area or like within a certain radius? And also, is it possible that someone would intentionally get themselves arrested for a completely different crime so they could be incarcerated, which would take any suspicion off of them? Like someone could get arrested for armed robbery. The person who committed this murder could intentionally get arrested for armed robbery, get put in jail, and no one's looking for, someone who's a sexual assailant to be in jail for armed robbery. Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility. Well, there was a lot of pieces in there, so I can say just generally that, geez, Lance, I'm not quite sure how to unpack this, but
I did it. I stumped you. I told you.
But
I told you.
Today, any felon in Colorado who's arrested on a felony, when they're incarcerated, their DNA sample was taken. But if they were arrested, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that may not necessarily be the case, because the collection of DNA in incarcerated individuals, that's evolved over time, and mostly because, there's been a case and now that leads to legislation. For example, today, all sexually violent predators in Colorado are required, to submit their DNA, which goes into the CODIS, the Combined DNA Information System that the FBI has so theoretically, and we believe this to be the case, that JonBenét's that the DNA from the JonBenét investigation is there in CODIS that was taken at the autopsy from her fingernails and her panties, and then the 2008 analysis with the long johns. We're told that that's in CODIS, but if, for example, Lance, the person that you're talking about, this hypothetical person, if they were arrested on an auto theft 5 years ago, would that necessarily, and they're convicted, who knows where, in Mesa, Colorado, and they're sentenced to the county jail, then their DNA probably wouldn't be in the system. So it's not an absolute that anybody who goes into the sex offender registry in Colorado has their DNA, because it depends on when they would go in. Also, if somebody's transferred from another state to Colorado, their DNA isn't brought in either. And so there are loopholes. If somebody's incarcerated before that legislation's enacted, and maybe we can catch them on the way out. We've done that. Colorado Springs Police Department did that to solve a 30-year-old case that I talk about in my book. And so that's a possibility too. But not every state's the same. Some other states, they're not required, to do the submittal, to CODIS. So it's still kind of hit and miss. Let me go back to your first part of your question, Lance, and that was what our team has done with our limited resources. We have followed up leads that have been sent directly to us. I might also mention that we've gotten some leads after the docuseries aired through our GoFundMe, and we did get some over the years through the GoFundMe, because you can not only just make a donation, but you can pass on a tip or lead. And so we've gotten leads through our GoFundMe account, to include some that came in after the docuseries has aired. And so some of the leads that have come in from other sources, emails, as a result of the docuseries, also went to the Ramsey family, and at least one of those leads also went to the Boulder Police Department. So if our team are getting leads, I would have to believe that the Boulder Police Department tip line has been blowing up, since the Netflix and the 2020 and, all of the talk that's going on now, to include, with your guys' podcast too, because there's a lot of swirl. The reason I wrote this book, multiple reasons, but one is to try to, as Lou always said, you have to stir the pot on a cold case to keep it from growing cold. And I think that's what my book did. It stirred that pot. But I think what the docuseries did that came out last month is it moved that pot to the front burner. And now, because of guys like you and the 2020 special, the pot is really, the heat's been turned up on the pot. And there's more people helping stir this pot and asking questions, and people who have thought, well, I thought, I had an uncle or whoever, that might have been involved with this. I think that now we're seeing so much more interest and attention, and I think this will continue through next week when the anniversary date. We would typically see, every year, things come up on the news and different programs. I think this is probably the best opportunity that we've had in the last 28 years to really get that right lead that we need. And we hope, and we don't care if this is the FBI, Boulder PD, Boulder DA, CBI, we don't care who solves this case. We just want to see the case solved. And if there's something our team can do, we're continually trying to support that effort any way we can. We just don't want, and this was Lou's dying wish. He said, I just don't want this case to die with me. So we're very encouraged with the kind of the electricity that's been generated this season and through everything. And so we're so appreciative, Tim and Lance, of what you and your program and your listeners, your viewers are doing, because that's what needs to happen to solve this case. We need to keep it alive. We need to keep the momentum going forward.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we are happy to contribute in that way. That is sort of the mission of this show. I know a lot of the comments mention how JonBenét was abused or potentially abused by her parents. Is there any evidence of abuse of JonBenét at the hands of the Ramsey parents or the family, I should say?
Absolutely none. And in fact, in this case, there's evidence to the contrary, to include a very well-respected, experienced pediatrician who had seen JonBenét through, she was only 6 years old, but he had seen her over 24 times. And he went on record and signed an affidavit saying, listen, I know this little girl. I've been with her, several times every year throughout her growth, throughout her childhood, since she was a little girl. And he says there has never, ever been an unexplained bruise or any indication at all that that the parents had ever abused, that this child has ever been abused by anybody. But then, when you hear John Ramsey's older parents, and then Burke, who was Patsy and John's child, when you listen to these children, the Ramseys, not only do they say we were never beaten, but they go on about how loved they were and the parents. So it's completely out of their character, their pattern, and it's just hard to fathom any parent that would stage a violent sexual assault to cover up for an accidental death, and convince the other parent that hey, you've got to go along with this, and that's just beyond rational thought.
It makes you wonder where those rumors even start from in the first place, because in the comments people will say something like, I heard she was abused, and so there's tracks or something to that effect. And to hear that a doctor actually went on record and to say this, that seen her how many times in her life? Like 12 times, you said? A dozen times?
No, I think it was over 20, like 24, 26.
Like 24 times, like regular visits.
Even more so, not only just wellness visits, but Patsy, because small town and pediatrician's just down the street. So anytime JonBenét would get a sniffle or cold, Patsy was always taking her, or Burke, always taking the children in, to see the doctor. So this doctor was intimately familiar with this little girl, this little patient. And he said, this is just bizarre. These parents are not, the type of parents that would abuse their child, let alone sexually abuse the parents. And when you look at, what was their life, before this happened, what was their life afterwards? There was never any domestic violence in the home. There was not one police report. It's the opposite. It's the evidence of, them being a loving, supporting couple and family. They were active. The parents were, especially Patsy, in both children's school. They were active in their church. One of the first persons who come to, the Boulder home, this is before JonBenét's even, her body's found, is the priest from the Episcopal Church. He was called, and he's leading prayer vigils in the Ramsey's home, which was part of the contamination of the crime scene. But still, the point was that the morning after Christmas, their priest is there in their home, leading prayer vigils. So that's not the type of people who would be involved in any kind of a family sexual abuse situation, and that never happened afterwards either.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. It also occurred to me that the ransom note probably would have been a lot shorter if this was a staged event. I mean, that makes no sense. So much of the ransom note makes no sense.
Well, it's really hard, Tim, when you try to get in the mind of a deviant person, because they're not rational. And so when you're trying to apply your logic and your rational thought, it misses that, because none of us, can really get into that person's mind. And, they're not rational people. They're almost always narcissists, that they think the law doesn't apply to them. They can do whatever they want to. And when you start adding, the sexual violence, was exhibited in this case, the foreign object penetration, that quickly gets outside of, my ability, to think how this person would think. And those are are thoughts that are not healthy to dwell on anyway. So, it's hard to put any rationalization to irrational behavior.
Yeah, well said. And there was a conversation that we had, I think it was one of our first conversations, where you had emphasized that a lot of this is trying to prove negatives, and that's
Right.
really tough to do.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've just repeated since then, because we see it in a lot of the stories that we talk about with missing individuals or murdered individuals, these cold cases, is that the compulsion to present a negative in order to prove it wrong is always there, and it does so much damage.
What a great thought, Lance, and I'm glad you brought that up again. As far as I know, the police report, and there was over like 10,000 pages that Lou, passed on. The only print, latent print that was found in the home that's unidentified is a palm print on the inside of the wine cellar on the inside of the door where JonBenét's body was found. That palm print has never been identified. But there was some speculation, it may be true, that the killers, maybe they wore gloves, that's why they didn't leave, fingerprints, or maybe the Boulder Police, who did not do a thorough job of investigating the crime scene the first time they were there, because they overlooked the body altogether. They didn't even go into that room. How thorough of a job did they do, in dusting for fingerprints, collecting fingerprints? So to say, well, there's no fingerprints, on the duct tape, or there's no fingerprints on the garrote, or something, that proves that it's a family member. Well, no, it doesn't. It just means that there was no fingerprints identified or collected. So it doesn't prove a negative doesn't prove positive. So.
I also feel like if this was a Ramsey family, murder, Patsy probably would have, or someone would have chosen to use something other than Patsy's personal paintbrush to make that garrote. Can you tell us a little bit more about the garrote and about the slip knot? I know we talked about the cord or the cable being uncommon, but also the knot. How common or uncommon was that slip knot?
The slip knot was not necessarily common, and it took somebody who had some knot tying skill, to tie that, so that the more that she struggled, the tighter it got. I don't think I could have reconstructed that, but the really intriguing use of the paracord 550 is on the garrote. And I'd worked over 100 homicides in my 30-year career. Lou had worked over 200 homicides in his 32-year career. And he and I talked about this many times. Neither one of us had ever personally been on a murder where a garrote was used. It's very unusual. And there are, and what's also unusual in this one is it was fashioned in situ, in place, with material that was readily at hand. And that's what I was going to mention, Tim, when I started to interrupt you a minute ago, and I'm glad you brought this question up about the garrote with the paintbrush, is there are a few people, perhaps, that may have specialized military training, SEALs or maybe Rangers or Special Forces, who've been taught how to fashion a garrote, to take out a sentry, come up from behind. We've all seen, mob movies, where somebody might have been executed with a garrote, using a piano wire or, fashion with a guitar string or something like that. But Lou and I, neither one had ever seen this. This is a highly unusual murder device. There's also not just the garrote that was used to cause her death, but also she was bludgeoned, and we didn't mention that she had a depressed skull fracture, an 8-inch skull fracture running laterally along the top right side of her head, to the point that the fracture that was depressed. The skull was actually forced in. And some people said, well, that shows that Patsy, in a fit of rage because of this recurring bedwetting incident, bumped her head against, the bathtub. Well, that's bizarre, because that would not have created this sufficient of a fracture. Lou had found a medical doctor who examined, not the coroner, but another doctor who examined through the photos. And he said his expert opinion was that the force that would have been required to create this depressed skull fracture would be equivalent to falling off of a 3-story building and landing on her head. And that's highly unusual, too, when you have 2 causes of death. You usually have 1 cause of death or another cause of death. But here, the coroner, who again was a very competent pathologist, he had 2 causal factors in the death: the strangulation using the manual strangulation using a device, which is unusual. Most strangulations, in a fit of rage would be, using your hands. Here, somebody's fashioned this garrote, and then the bludgeoning, with some. It took an object, to cause that. Lou believed that the object was possibly the aluminum baseball bat that was found outside of the Ramsey's home on the north side of the residence, and there was a fiber from the carpet that came out of the basement. So I think he's probably right there. But the garrote was fashioned in the boiler room while JonBenét is still alive and she's struggling, and we know that because some of her hair was entangled in the knot, and you can see that in the crime scene photos. So this killer has the presence of mind to get her from her bedroom on the 2nd floor to the basement, to this room that's secluded. He's now creating, the garrote first, then the ligatures around the wrists, and he reaches over into the paint tray and finds this paintbrush, and he breaks it into 3 parts. The bristled end he just deposits back into the paint tray. The middle end is what he uses to fashion this garrote, this really unusual, elaborate device that's used to control her. But the 3rd piece, the tip, that's what I was trying to insert a while ago, Tim, a minute ago, was that the tip of that paintbrush is not in the body, it's not at the crime scene, it's gone, it's missing. So this killer had to have taken the tip of that paintbrush out of the home, along with the duct tape, along with the stun gun, along with, what was left of the cordage. So that's extremely unusual. The only time that Lou or I had ever seen, something similar on a sexual assault might be where the killer takes something personal of the victims. It might be an undergarment or something, takes that with them as kind of a trophy or something to, relive, this event. Very, very unusual MO.
Yeah, and I know in the Douglas book, I guess he said that the killer was mission driven and not MO driven, which I found interesting. I never really considered anything like that, but he sort of mentioned that as a reason why there's never been another similar crime.
I like that analogy. I never got to meet John Douglas, but he was very well respected within the FBI, with the Behavioral Sciences Unit. I'd worked with some other people with BSU, and matter of fact, the first violent crime from Colorado, the first entry into the VICAP program, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, CO, I'll never forget the number, CO-35, 35th one in the nation, was a case that Lou and I had worked together, a very violent murder, when we were partners. And so I had gotten to know the people at VICAP and the behavioral sciences. And John Douglas was very well respected within the Bureau and within the law enforcement community. And he supported Lou's intruder theory, and he also said, this would not be consistent with a parental, murder and staging this. This is not what we're looking at. And I think that added a lot of credibility to Lou. And again, Lou started with a lone voice in the wilderness. It wasn't the Ramseys. And, more voices have added on there. But I think John Douglas's voice caused, a lot of people to, wait a minute, this is a very credible person who's analyzed this. But I think what the docuseries and Netflix did was even take that to the next level, where it said, here you can see, listen to what Lou Smit is explaining, look at the photographs of the autopsy with the stun gun, look at the depressed skull fracture from the autopsy. Does this look like this little girl was accidentally, bumped her head, against the bathtub? And I think it really did start bringing in sufficient evidence that people are saying, "Now, wait a minute, this really doesn't look like it, what we've been told all along." And no wonder Lou, who really did have the best view of the evidence and the experience to analyze it and interpret it, why he really did believe it was an intruder.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. John, I did want to ask you about the press conference from Boulder PD on December 30th, 1996, and the contrast between that press conference and what the NYPD did regarding the murder of CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson.
What a fascinating case to watch, and the contrast between what Boulder PD did back in 96 and what NYPD did just here within the last couple of weeks are remarkable. And NYPD, and I've worked with some of those homicide detectives over the years, and they're very experienced, very well trained, very well supervised, and very committed. In the case with the press conference, for example, they came out, that day, and shared information in great detail. They talked about spent shell casings, what was written on the shell casings. That press conference was followed up the next day as they got more information, and they started putting out, those video clips immediately about what this guy looked like, even though, he was wearing a hoodie and whatever. And what they started doing was getting the community involved. And what that press conference was a textbook on how to conduct an excellent press conference. They had the police commissioner, they had the deputy chief of investigations there. They'd written out what they wanted to say. It had all been choreographed to where it was, in my mind, one of the best press conferences I've ever seen, and it helped them identify the killer, get people involved. People started calling in, and they started getting experts' opinions. And one of the things that NYPD knows very well, it's called ComStat. And part of this came out of community-oriented policing in the 70s and 80s when I was active. Some of it came after 9/11, and particularly with Homeland Security, using technology, facial recognition, those kinds of things. But what they know very, very well is a principle, crime production or investigation principle that's referred to as early identification and rapid incapacitation. Early identification, rapid incapacitation. So what that means is the quicker we can get this person identified, then the quicker we can incapacitate them. We can get them arrested off the streets. And that's exactly the opposite of what happened in Boulder 26 years ago. They did not, in fact, they delayed early identification. They delayed that by not revealing the evidence of who, like the DNA that excluded the family. They've kept the family under this umbrella of suspicion. That media conference, and I watched it live. And this public information officer, when she makes the statement that, well, we've got DNA from the Ramsey family, except for Patsy, and then she deviates and she gives her opinion, and she says, oh, whether she was too distraught or whatever. Well, one, the information again is false. Patsy had given the information. And I was a public information officer for Colorado Springs PD, and I spoke many times in front of the media when I was the sheriff. And you never give your opinion. My opinion might be this was a horribly brutal crime, and whatever. But you don't give your opinion. You state your facts, and that's what they did with NYPD. Is they gave facts, one fact after another after another. They updated the media the next day, and that's what helped lead to this killer being arrested in another state in a McDonald's because they got the community involved. Well, in Boulder, they did the opposite. They continued to, provide misinformation. Not that they didn't even have a press conference for the first several days until the 30th, and then when they did, it was kind of scripted, to again put pressure on the parents and feed into the tabloids. And when you don't have a system where you're periodically giving information to the media, then they have to go out, because they get pressure too. So they're looking for, the story, and they're not being fed. And so they, in this case, some real horrible things that the media did that compounded what was going on with the police and the lack of information is someone was able to convince a Boulder area law enforcement officer, not with the Boulder PD, to provide them inside information for a fee, for $50 an hour for whatever you want to do. The crime lab that was the independent photo lab that the crime lab with Boulder PD was using to develop the crime scene photos. The photos were purchased by some tabloids so that they could, put some of the crime scene photos out, and the media, to include the local media in the Denver metro area, they were using their sources, and some of those sources were police officers who, well, I can't talk on, condition of anonymity or whatever their statement was, but they were providing, well, I heard there's no footprints in the snow, and I heard there was no point of entry. And the media, because they didn't have any other information, and they couldn't run this past anybody with the Boulder PD that was answering them, they ran with that. And they had a lot of anonymous information or single source information or undisclosed sources. And so the media compromised. And this comes out, in the docuseries that Netflix did about how the media took shortcuts. And I think not only was the Boulder Police Department to be embarrassed, the way this was mishandled, but I think the media in some of the professional news reporters and journalists, who bought into this too and contributed to this. I thought it was a real example of how not to do something back then. And if nothing else, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, was I hope there could be some lessons learned, on how to properly investigate a crime such as this, a violent crime, but also how to report it, how to share it with your community in a factual way.
Unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable the work that you've put into it and the work that the investigative team has put into it, and the fact that this is decades and decades on, and still, like I think you said, there's this electricity that you can feel, or this energy that is seeming to be building right now. It's remarkable to me that there aren't any clear answers, but I'm with you on that. I feel that there is some energy, some buzz, and something that is going to come forward. I don't have any idea of the time frame, but it has that feeling. So I think you're right.
Well, let's hope, Lance. And Tim, thank you both for having me back on your show. I don't know if we're out of questions, but I just wanted to, again, acknowledge the work that you guys are doing and the support for my book, for this story, for Lou and JonBenét. Getting the truth out there is sincerely appreciated, not just by me, but by everybody that's involved. So thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, John. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge of this case, and your time here on this live show. I think it was great, and we're finally getting these negative comments here in the chat. But we're pretty much coming to the end of this conversation. But yeah, I don't know. Is someone saying that Patsy's ambidextrous? We're back to one of the first comments here about evidence and how it can lead you in one of two ways, and it's really fascinating to me. But yeah, personally, I don't think Patsy being ambidextrous is evidence of anything.
No, even if she was, but this is something that I'm kind of in a unique position to comment on, because how many people out there have actually met Patsy Ramsey? Well, I have. How many have met John Ramsey? Well, I have many times. Or I've not met Burke, but I've met John Andrew. And I sat down for a couple hours with Patsy and John and Lou in Colorado Springs when I was still the sheriff, and how many other people have actually talked to violent criminals or arrested them or investigated homicides or notified grieving parents, that their child's not coming home. And I have done that. But when someone says, I heard this about Patsy, and whatever, that's based upon information that they've received from somewhere, from the media or whatever, or some experience in their life. But again, a unique kind of experience was, ask them, have you met Patsy? I mean, did you? Well, you won't now. She's deceased, but when she was alive, did you have the opportunity to sit and talk to her? And what was your opinion of her? And after 2 hours, there was no doubt in my mind that she was a poor, grieving, distraught mother. But Lou was a better judge of character than I was, or I'll ever be. And he spent many, many more hours with both John and Patsy. And he walked away absolutely convinced, from meeting them. And then you compare that with the physical evidence. Um, uh, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that Lou had the privilege of knowing that family, you know, and then you contrast that with other violent, offenders. And someone says, well, yeah, I thought, this guy was, really strange. And it doesn't surprise me to be involved with this. The Ramsey's family is the exact opposite. They were a very successful, very loving couple, very successful with the business and their personal lives, their spiritual lives, and completely out of character. So, yeah, the person who did this violent sexual murder is not, a loving parents.
I just have one quick question. How long was it before they called 911 after they found the body?
Well, it's the other way around. They called 911 shortly after 5 a.m. when Patsy found the note. And the police, to their credit, they arrived at the Ramsey home within 3 minutes. So when the call came in at 5-something a.m. through 911, within 3 minutes, Boulder Police were on the front step of the Ramsey home. And then, they brought in other investigators. One of the bad things they did is they didn't secure the crime scenes. Another bad thing is the first responder officer read the ransom note and then handed it back, and then they handed it to the supervisor who arrives, and then they handed it to the priest, and they handed it to the next person. So the ransom note gets handled and passed around to many other people, so it gets contaminated. The crime scene's contaminated, but it wasn't until early afternoon. I think it was like 7 hours after the police had been there and processed the crime scene, was the body found, and that was when the family is waiting for the phone call from the kidnappers, to say, well, you need to take this $118,000, over here, and then we'll release your daughter. And it was one detective, Linda Arndt, who had been left at the crime scene waiting for that call to come in. And it was supposed to come in at 10 a.m. according to the note. And 10 a.m. comes and goes, and John Ramsey, Patsy too, they're anxious. Well, what's happening? Who's doing what? Why aren't the FBI here? And so Linda Arndt gives John a task of, search the house again, see if there was anything that was overlooked, anything out of place. And so when he's following her directions, she says, take one person with you, one of the guys, and search the house again. And that's when they go downstairs in the basement, and that's when the body's found. But by then, it's over 7 hours, maybe closer to 8 or 9 hours after the initial 911 call when the body's found.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. There was some comments in there about how the family wasn't like eagerly awaiting the call and how they weren't acting in a consistent way that, parents who cared act. And I mean,
yeah, I know where part of that may have come from, Lance, and it's addressed in the docuseries, maybe even in the 2020 special with Detective Linda Arndt, who none of these detectives had ever worked a homicide case, let alone, a kidnap or ransom. So they're kind of, flying blind here. And she's in the living room watching the parents, waiting for the phone to ring. And one of the things she comments on in the docuseries is that she sees John Ramsey go into the kitchen or wherever, and he's starting to go through the mail. And she thinks that he's being very nonchalant, and disinterested, and just looking at the mail that's come in. And when you hear John Ramsey's explanation on the docuseries on the 2020 special, he says that's completely, off base. He said these are letters, that came in through the mail slot of our front door, and they were piling up. So he says, I picked those up, and I'm looking through there just to see if there's another correspondence, another letter, from the killers, the abductors. And so people who are saying, oh, they're not acting right, they're not, distraught or whatever. John is trying to keep his wits about him as he explains it. He says, I'm trying to get the money together. I'm trying to, figure out how to do everything I can to get my daughter back safely. And so this is such an unusual case, a kidnap for ransom, that was the way things have unfolded. It's, well, how are they supposed to act? So I think there's a lot of disinformation, in people's opinions that, are it's just like the comment of Patsy being ambidextrous. Well, is she or isn't she? Doesn't matter. Is that going to change the DNA? So this is a DNA case. We've got to find who that unknown male DNA belongs to. That's on 3 different locations, on her clothing, on her body. That's the key. That's what we got to find. Then everything else will fall into place. And if we can use databases, that's what other law enforcement agencies are doing all the time, to crack these. That's how the Golden Gate Killer was abducted. You didn't have to have the killer, if you can get in that killer's family tree, and that's what we need to do. We need to be able to access that genetic database on the private sector and get into that person's family tree. And then lead it to our killer.
As a former homicide investigator and detective, wouldn't it have been relatively easy to prove that the Ramseys committed the murder if they had?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. With the circumstances, had it been one of the family members, I think that would have been solved. What again is interesting in this one of the lead detectives, Steve Thomas, thinks it's Patsy, absolutely convinced it is. And then another lead detective, Lynn Arndt, thinks it's the dad, John Ramsey, and they both can't be right. So what they're doing is they've come up with, a suspect that they're trying to, fit the evidence into, while they're ignoring the evidence of the intruder. And that's not going to get you very far down the road.
Okay, we're back here for final thoughts after the marathon live show with John Wesley Anderson. What a fun time that was.
I know, and again, like saying that we had a fun time talking about this topic is something that is awkward in my head, but somehow it is. I mean, somehow speaking to him makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel like you're being a part of a productive conversation. There's so much out there about JonBenét Ramsey's murder that is just conflated or exaggerated, flat out wrong, and people have been so dug in on their theory about the family being responsible for this and not seeing the things that are so obviously pointed away from that. I didn't know anything about the sworn statement from JonBenét's doctor saying that she had routine checkups for like over 24 routine checkups, and he signed a document. He swore to it legally. I mean, he signed it, and I've never seen it. Hopefully we could see it, but I don't think that John is lying about this. But he said there was never any signs of abuse, not even a suspicious bruise on her body. But we still have people saying like, oh, well, her family abused her, her mom beat her.
Yeah, or the bed. They point to her bedwetting as evidence of sexual assault history, and I think that can be indicative at times, but it was not apparently in JonBenét's case.
Right. Right, but that's the problem. People will see that one fact and they'll be like, "Well, this is indicative of a sexual assault." Well, it's also indicative of a, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old in general. I mean, it's a pretty common problem.
Yeah, and my gosh, it's an unspeakable tragedy, Lance. But I do feel like that we're helping push the best theory in this case with Lou Smit's intruder theory. And again, I know people are disagreeing as we speak right now. People are disagreeing, I'm sure. But my question to you and those folks is, what is the evidence that you point to that says the Ramseys did it? I mean, we had a long talk in this conversation about the evidence, and I just feel like there is none. I mean, I get that there's some, I suppose, circumstantial things that you could say behaviorally is bizarre or just confusing, like they wanted to fly to Georgia and John was told not to leave, but he was going to fly anyway. But he wanted to bury JonBenét in Georgia, where they were from. So I don't know. I do feel like there are explanations for just about anything that folks have to point at the Ramseys, and it's just nothing to grasp on anyway.
Yeah. I don't know how I would behave after I discover my child in that position in the wine cellar, brutally murdered, and he physically touched her, carried her, and people are questioning some of the things he did after that. I mean, the poor man's mind must have been a complete wreck, and I can fault no one in his position for saying, "I want to go to Georgia to prepare for my daughter's burial." Maybe he just needed to get out of there for a little. Maybe that was like, even if he was saying it just to, what is he going to do at that point and in his home? You know what I mean? Like, in that state of mind, I don't fault him for saying anything about anything. Like, so, and the bottom line is he never left. So
yeah, and it's not a different country, like he could have been brought back if he was going to face charges.
Yeah. Yeah. And I totally understand law enforcement saying you can't go. You have to, I mean, absolutely. But it's not like this is a thing that happens to him every day and he knows how to deal with it. I mean, again, I would have no idea. I would have no idea what my brain would do and what stupid things I would say if this had happened. And the thing about the mail, how he seemed like nonchalantly going over and checking the mail. He just got a ransom note. Maybe he was going to see if there was something else there.
I mean, that's a great point, because there was something very foreign and bizarre left on their staircase, in the form of the ransom note that was, written in the home, most likely, or probably definitely, I guess. But I don't know. I guess people point to the ransom note as evidence that Patsy did it, or that the parents, conspired to stage the scene or something. I just don't think that's how scenes are staged, for a few reasons. Why didn't the Ramseys stage a break-in, like a more clear break-in, if they were staging the scene?
Right. Given the opportunity to stage the scene. Yeah. Right. Why didn't they kick the door in so it looked like it was, kicked off of its, like out of the frame or something? Tip over some furniture, something.
I mean, what they wouldn't have done is make it like a question whether or not someone entered through that window, And I do understand there are some questions on it still. It seems to me that's what happened, that the intruder came in through that window. And John immediately didn't assume that. because he had apparently come in through that window when he locked himself out. It was like a year or so before. But he did note the suitcase that was right under it, standing on its side, with the ability for someone to stand on it and, push themselves up and over. As we talked about on one of these last conversations, like something crazy happened. Either an intruder got in, wrote a ransom note, was waiting around for them to return, left the note, abducted JonBenét, or I should say was planning to abduct JonBenét, took her down to the basement, was possibly going to go out through that same window that he came in, but changed his mind, or something happened that made him not think that he could pull that off or something, right? So that's weird. Like that whole thing, like I think when people think of like a killer or a kidnapper or an abductor, it's like a one-track mind. You're not going to change your mind mid-abduction, but I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I guess that seems to be what happened. But what's even crazier than that is if you look at the other side of it and say, no, I do think the Ramseys did it. And I think, whether or not Patsy, again, who had survived stage 4 cancer at this point, just, launched into some violent rage because of bedwetting or, whatever theory you want. But Burke hit her because he was always abused. I'm just pulling something from my hat because I don't believe it. But whatever it is, for the Ramseys to have said, okay, well, instead of calling the police or calling an ambulance, we have to stage this. We have to murder her, sexually assault her, and stage this scene. Like that is so much crazier to me than an intruder.
Yeah, I mean, we've met. We met John Ramsey at a crime con. Not for a long enough period of time to get to know him, but we had a quick conversation, and we saw him from, interacting with other people. I mean, he doesn't look like a cold-blooded killer. He didn't act like someone who had gotten away with murder, and he was at CrimeCon. I mean, he's putting himself out there. He's trying to explain his family's side of all of this. Okay, so you were just talking about how something wild, something incredible, something crazy must have happened in the house for this person to flip the switch from ransom note kidnapping to sexual assault murder. And John had mentioned a couple of times, and it didn't really even resonate until the second or third time he said it, that Lou nothing was off the table for Lou, including there being more than one. So it does kind of make sense in my head if I were to build a scenario that one person is handling JonBenét and the other person is writing a ransom note. And then the one handling JonBenét, that got out of control. And that person maybe never even intended to kidnap her or whatever, but, only intended to kill her, to sexually assault and kill her. And that scenario got out of control. Maybe. But that means that now there are two people out there who have never been caught. So that kind of puts a damper on that specific scenario.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the ransom note says, says we're a foreign faction, I think it says.
Yeah. But that's what one person would write to try to make it seem like there's a few people involved.
A bigger conspiracy there. Yeah, I mean, and if there is more than one person, the chances of catching more than one person go up because the evidence available, in touch DNA and things like that. But also just words, right? Talking. Like two people needing to keep that secret as opposed to one.
Yeah.
I do feel like it's one person, and I kind of feel like the person was younger, was like in his 20s. That's my belief at the time of this. And, in listening to that John Douglas book, he said that that the killer was mission driven and not so much MO driven. So you may not find other abductions or attempted kidnappings that are similar. So he kind of put him in a different category than like a typical serial killer, which is interesting to me.
Why did you say 20s? Why do you think he's in his 20s?
I think there's some immaturity, a lot of immaturity, I would say, and also a lot of time to watch all those movies, Dirty Harry, Speed, all these movies that were sort of cited in this ransom note. But also, this is someone who was apparently just unaccounted for on Christmas night. Either snuck out of his house, or lived alone, or just wasn't intending to be with family that night. I don't know, but I do feel like that's a big clue, because Christmas night can be a family night for people. I know in my family it had been for years. Christmas night. So I don't know. I feel like there's a clue there. It's like who wasn't with their family on Christmas night, who was old enough to pull this off, aware enough of JonBenét and that family, but also like who consumed movies and had that kind of weird ass imagination.
I know that ransom letter does kind of strike as very immature, and I guess the general belief is that ransom letter was written before.
I think so. I think that only makes sense because time was taken in writing that. And if the intruder theory is true, then this person was in the house before the family got home. So not sure how much time he would have had, but enough time to write that rambling, bizarre-ass ransom note, but also like a couple of attempts before that. Mm-hmm. And also hanging out in the guest room and things like that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder if the kidnapping just wasn't ever going to be a thing. The ransom note was written to make it look like a kidnapping gone wrong or something. But it's not, because it's so clearly, the evidence shows it's so clearly a sexual assault. It's driven by not driven by a sexual assault, but it appears to be primarily a sexual assault. And I don't mean, who said this on one of our shows, that sexual assault doesn't have to necessarily have to do specifically with the act of sex. Like the act of strangling her a little bit to control her is a form of like some sort of sexual desire that's being released. So there's something against like this person ever wanting to abduct her.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like they did intend to, and something went wrong. That's my thought. Like, either she struggled more than he was expecting, or he wasn't strong enough to lift her out through that window. And furthermore, like, how's he going to do it? Right? It's like a weird placement of this window. If you're in the basement, it's like up. It's like up 6 feet or something like that. So that's why he's standing on this suitcase. But how would you do it, right? You put JonBenét through the window first, and then she has the chance to run off if she's conscious. Or do you go first, and then what? You're holding on to JonBenét and trying to pull her up through? So I just feel like that part of the plan was bad, and I do think they intended to kidnap her, but they just didn't really have an answer on how to do it.
I mean, why not just go out the front door?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's definitely a question that people ask. I don't know.
I mean, the person obviously had some sort of means of getting away, and if the intent was to kidnap, then they're obviously going to need a vehicle. So why wouldn't they just leave a vehicle in a spot where they could run to, even if an alarm went off? And
yeah, I think that's the answer, is that there was an alarm. Yeah.
But then find an easier window, find an easier place to, if that's the case, if this person was in the home. See, this is a good conversation, because how did the person get into the home? Because I'm assuming that the alarm was set when the Ramseys left.
Yeah, so I think house alarms work in a variety of ways. Some of them have sensors by each door. That's what I'm imagining was the case in the Ramsey's house. A lot of them won't have each window marked, but some of them have like motion sensors inside that would trip the alarm if the alarm is set. So that's a good question, because that apparently didn't happen, right? If this
Right.
intruder was in there, either the motion part of that alarm wasn't set on the interior, or this person knew how to evade it in some way.
I know. This is why it's been going on since 1996.
Yeah, and my final thought here is just like what we said at the end of the conversation. Like, I really feel like both Ramseys would have been arrested, prosecuted, and found guilty if they were guilty. I just feel like it probably would have been an easy case to try if they were guilty.
Because the law enforcement wanted them to be guilty. So
yeah.
So with them wanting them to be guilty, they could have found something that was a little bit more than circumstantial but
they never did.
And they never did.
30 years, in 30 years, there just isn't anything.
Oh,
so,
but Patsy's ambidextrous.
Big thanks to everyone who listened to these episodes, and please check out the book, Lou and JonBenét, and if you believe in what the Smit family is doing in the investigation, please donate to that GoFundMe. It is important work, in our opinion, and I'm gonna say I think there's gonna be a solve in this case. I really do. I think
there's gonna be a break.
I feel like we're getting there. It just, something about it is feeling like that. And the documentary, the book, I feel like it's all leading to some more clarity in this case.
Exactly. That electricity that John said is building.
Yeah.
And my final thought is, again, if anyone knows where my book is, please message me.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. We really appreciate it. Happy holidays, and please follow us on social media at MissingCSM. Thank you.